Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaidó is set to meet U.S. Vice President Mike Pence on Monday, after asking other countries to consider all options to remove President Nicolas Maduro from power. Guaidó's comments came after a day of violence, as opposition supporters spent hours trying to break a government blockade and carry food and medical supplies into Venezuela. At least 4 people were killed and more than 300 injured. "The events of today oblige me to take a decision," Guaidó said on Twitter, "to formally propose to the international community that we should keep all options open to achieve the liberation of our homeland." The 35-year-old, who transformed Venezuelan politics and united a fractured and ineffective opposition when he declared himself interim president in January, has repeatedly said his focus is on a peaceful transition and new elections. But his comments on Saturday raised concerns he might be considering a military intervention and were soon picked up by U.S. hawks including the Florida Senator Marco Rubio. The grave crimes committed today by the Maduro regime have opened the door to various potential multilateral actions not on the table just 24 hours ago, Rubio said in response to Guaidó, also on Twitter. On Sunday morning, he added, "The willingness of many nations to support stronger multilateral actions to dislodge them has increased dramatically." U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was more circumspect, saying further action will be contemplated at Monday's meeting of the regional Lima Group, in the Colombian capital Bogotá, but focusing on sanctions, humanitarian aid and actions by Venezuelans themselves. "The Venezuelan people will ultimately, I believe, hold accountable those who have done so much harm to the fundamental basic rights of the people of Venezuela," he told CNN's State of the Nation. Donald Trump did not immediately respond to Guaidó, but he said last month all options were on the table, and has suggested invading Venezuela both in public and private. "There have always been strands of the Venezuelan opposition who have called for military intervention, and as the standoff on Saturday dragged on, some in the crowd trying to push aid across the border called for the use of force instead. We need a military intervention," one opposition supporter shouted as she passed a news crew on the Francisco de Paula Santander Bridge, which links Cúcuta in Colombia with the Venezuelan town Urena, a call that was greeted with cheers from others around her. David Smolinski, opposition leader in exile and close friend and ally of Guaidó, insisted they were not calling for troops on the ground. "It is still a peaceful movement," he said. "Violence yesterday came from armed pro-government gangs and security forces." But pressed on whether he would support military intervention in future, he declined to rule it out. "The only option we have is to restore democracy and freedom with internal and external pressure." Analysts warn there is a serious risk of sliding into armed conflict, and say many of those pushing for intervention are underestimating the cost and possible impact of sending foreign troops to Venezuela. "Unfortunately, the odds of the crisis escalating into conflict are still very real," said Jeff Ramsey, assistant director for Venezuela at the Washington office on Latin America. "I think there are actors on both sides that actually think armed conflict could be desirable. The clearest risk is that it would devolve into an internal armed conflict that could last decades. An intervention would be bloody, costly, and would likely rely on some kind of mid- or long-term occupation that would have to counter insurgent groups." Discussions about military intervention in Venezuela have focused largely on taking on the armed forces. But there are also hundreds of thousands of people outside the military who are armed and experienced, from pro-government gangs to Colombian guerrillas the ELN. Ramsey estimates that there may be between 500,000 and 2 million members of informal militias, many old and poorly trained, but if even 10% could be mobilized to fight for Maduro, it would be a powerful force. The FARC group that destabilized Colombia for decades only had around 18,000 fighters at its peak.